Hi, I'm David Riley,
I'm Nicholas Harvey.
and this is Three Distinct Knocks. With us tonight, we have Brother T.S. Akers, who has written several books about Freemasonry, the history of Freemasonry in Oklahoma, including Knights on the Prairie, a history of Templary in Oklahoma, the illustrious Grand Masters of Oklahoma Cryptic Masonry, the Grand High Priest of Oklahoma Royal Arch Masonry, and then a book not related to Freemasonry, Chile, Mcintosh, and the Muscogee Creek Nation. Um, T.S. is a citizen of the Creek tribe, and today we're going to be talking to him about the historical connections between Freemasonry and Native Americans. But before we get to that, as is our ancient tradition, we have a rant. Staying safer at home has given me some opportunities. I've been working on a book I hope to see published someday. I've learned a bit about running a webinar, and I've binge rewatched the show Community, among other things. In the show Community, they sometimes discuss the multiple universe theory. The idea that it is that every decision, every possibility and combination thereof is played out somewhere in a parallel universe. That's real theoretical physics, sort of. On the show, of course, there's a darkest timeline, and evil versions of our characters emerge from it and cause comedic havoc. To many, this might seem like the darkest timeline. As of today, nearly 26,000 Americans are known to have died from COVID 19. The real total is likely higher as testing capability remains scant. Many Americans have been sheltering in their homes, doing their best to stay safe and keep their communities safe for a month now. I would like to urge all of our listeners to act like Masons. Reach out to our members with kids. They've been locked in a home with children who are having to go to school via the web, if at all. The kids miss their friends and their routines. They're stressed, and as a result, the parents are stressed. Isolation is difficult for all of us, but particularly for the elderly who may not have the technology or understanding to do virtual meetings and education. Loneliness is a deadly thing. Reach out to our older members and let them know that you're thinking of them. Check and see if they have the supplies that they need. Domestic violence is on the rise. Those who are in toxic and violent relationships may be unable to get away from their tormentors. If you know someone or suspect that someone is in such a situation, give them a call. Check in. Make sure that they are okay. Do your part. Wear your mask when you go out. Don't go out unless you must. Appreciate the essential workers who are taking risks to keep our grocery stores open and our mail being delivered. Be a good, peaceable citizen. And when this is over, I will see you in Lodge. And that's the rant for today. So, TS, I'm sure that many many of our listeners are vaguely aware that there has been Masonic membership among Native Americans for a very long time. Um, but do you have, but I don't have a good understanding of when Freemasonry was introduced to Native Americans and it became a part, when they became a part of our tradition. Do you know when the earliest Freemason among Native Americans was?
So I don't have an exact year of that, but Freemasonry and Native Americans, the two didn't become joined, I guess you could say, until European contact. So I mean,
Right.
there are anecdotal stories of Masonic blood brothers and initiatic societies in Native American culture that resemble Freemasonry, but Freemasonry, as we know it, was not introduced Native Americans until European contact. So, that's the late 1600s, mid, early 1700s in the southeastern portion of the United States. As far as the first Native American to become a Freemason, um, I don't know a lot about the northeastern tribes, but among the southeastern tribes, or what we call the five tribes, um, you know, those men who were active in tribal politics and were skirting the boundaries of European culture and Native culture, they began to be initiated into the fraternity in the early mid 1800s. You're looking at 1820s, 30s, and 40s, and that would have been some of those fellows joining lodges when they still lived in the East, like John Ross, who was the chief of the Cherokee Nation, and then others who took the degrees of Freemasonry on visits to Washington, D.C., while they were there on tribal business during the removal period. And when I say the removal period, you're looking at 1827 through the 1830s. Of course, the Indian Removal Act was in 1830, but a number of citizens of the five tribes had already begun to move west to the Indian Territory because not forcibly removed, but because they saw the handwriting on the wall. They understood what was coming.
So, if a lot of these tribal leaders who went to DC and took the degrees of Freemasonry and then returned back, did they start lodges?
So the first lodge in Indian Territory that would have been principally composed of Native Americans was established in Tahlequah, Indian Territory in 1848. And that was Cherokee Lodge, which still exists today in Oklahoma. It now has the lodge number of 10, but it was originally chartered under the jurisdiction of Arkansas. And that was the first lodge of indigenous membership. The men who would have joined the fraternity before they had moved to what became the Indian Territory, they would have joined, would have been white lodges, I guess you could say, and become affiliated with Freemasonry there. But there aren't that many men that joined Freemasonry before they became wet. So that's a limited number of individuals, but primarily, um, indigenous involvement with Freemasonry amongst the five tribes really gained ground once they came to the Indian Territory. And Masonic activity in the Indian Territory began with the establishment of Fort Gibson in the 1820s. That post was the end of the earth at the time, but it was established at the confluence of the Arkansas and Verdigris rivers to oversee Indian affairs in that region.
So, what do you think was the attraction of Freemasonry to those early men who joined?
So, what the attraction, and this is my opinion, and based on my research, is that tribal leadership, what we would call the tribal headmen, and tribal politics were primarily dominated by mixed blood Native Americans. And these were men who they might have been, half and half, but they were European and they were indigenous. And when they were the European side of it was usually Scottish or Irish. When the Scottish and the Irish came to the New World, they sort of were living on the fringes of society. My family, when we came here, we were enemies of the crown, so we were not welcomed in the British colonies of Georgia. So we took up residence in the Creek Nation. But what these mixed blood men saw was an avenue to continue their existence as a sovereign nation while navigating the waters of the United States government. The men, the Indian agents, army officers, the men that could provide legislative influence to better the tribe's positions were typically Freemasons. So when Fort Gibson was established in the Indian Territory by Matthew Arbuckle, Arbuckle was a Freemason. And he brought with him a cadre of officers that included Freemasons. And then the men that would dominate politics, tribal politics, they all joined Freemasonry, so they could have that connection and be able to negotiate from a better standing point.
Did it ever clash? So it wasn't the So it was the sons of the original Native Americans that were here that joined, right? So the people that came over, and then you said that they were mixed blood, and then those people are the ones that joined Freemasonry, right?
So I wouldn't, not necessarily sons, but some of these guys would have been full bloods. But that's a hard distinction to make. But by the 1830s, you're dealing with you're dealing with a second generation that has had European contact.
Got it. Okay. And then how did, forgive me, I should know more of this. How did so we know from Freemasonry that you have to believe in God, right? But I don't know historically how the term God may have changed throughout the history of Freemasonry. So were they Christian? Did they have some sort of like, what do you know about that?
So and here's the reason why Freemasonry really took off with the 5 tribes once they made it to the Indian Territory. Conversions to Christianity were on the rise and becoming quite common in the 1830s and 1840s. So a lot of we had Baptist missionaries, Methodist missionaries, Presbyterian missionaries in the Indian Territory. These Baptists and Methodists in particular sent men who were Freemasons. In my home lodge, which is Eufaula Lodge number 1, one of our founding members was a Baptist missionary named H.F. Buckner. He converted my 4th great grandfather to Christianity, and he became a Baptist minister. And a lot of these guys that were involved with the Baptist church at the time became Freemasons. So it was they were converting to Christianity pretty rapidly in the 1830s and 1840s, particularly in the Indian Territory.
Do you find it's the case that the vast majority, or maybe even all of the men who identified as Native would have been Christian converts before they joined Freemasonry?
I believe so, yeah. And again, they're mixed bloods, so they have this European concept of Christianity, so that's already coming, but they're still practicing native or I prefer indigenous religious practices. So a lot of these guys, the term is employed that they live in 2 worlds, so they can move between traditionalist indigenous culture and they can move between European culture. So it's to their benefit to live in 2 worlds.
Right. And at its best, it seems to me, and we're all aware that Freemasonry is composed of men who aren't always all at their best, but at its best, it seems to me that Freemasonry would facilitate that to some degree, and that it would be a more open place, but also a place where education can happen on the norms of Western civilization, the norms of Western behavior, the expectations of Western behavior, but in a place that's more accepting of the differences among men.
I think that's pretty spot on, and it kind of harkens to me of perhaps the British Lodge experience in India, where you have different cultures combining, forming lodges.
Which brings me to the next point. The history of European contact with indigenous cultures in all places and at all times, it has not been a pretty history. There's been a lot of violence and a lot of blood and a lot of misery as a result of it. Do you think that Freemasonry helped mitigate some of that in some places?
I don't know that it necessarily did for indigenous peoples in America in the East, owing to it wasn't indigenous involvement in Freemasonry wasn't that widespread at that time. But I think it once you came to the Indian Territory and you had these men coming together to form lodges, I think it helped here because the Masonic Lodge became sort of like it was a focal point of the community. So, you know, the Masonic Hall in Tahlequah, which was is still the capital of the Cherokee Nation, it became a community center essentially. So I mean, it was this focal point in town. Um, the five tribes interaction with British and European culture is interesting because I mean you've got warfare and bloodshed, but they welcomed these Scotsmen into their homelands, and these Scotsmen married into the tribes and produced children who would often become to be important tribal leaders. I once had a girl tell me she didn't realize that I was a citizen of the Creek Nation. He said, even if your ancestors never harmed a Creek citizen or killed a Creek citizen, you still need to recognize that white imperialism. And I'm like, I am indigenous, and the Creeks fought a civil war, so we had our own bloodshed, throughout the 19th century as well, where we were killing each other over, and our civil war was over traditionalists um, fighting what we would call the civilized element of the tribe. I don't like to use that term, but you had these traditionalists who were primarily full bloods fighting the mixed bloods who were adopting European ways, and a lot of that adoption again was for survival, because if you saw the handwriting on the wall, you knew that the United States was going to spread out across the land, but you had to do what could be done in order to assure your sovereignty, your survival, and being able to interact with those men who had that influence was important, because the history of the Creek Nation in particular is a series of unfortunate events when it comes to treaties with the United States. So, during the middle of the War of 1812, there was a Creek Civil War raging, which was called the Red Sticks War. The United States was drawn into it because some white settlements were attacked by the traditionalist Creek element. The Creek Nation was then divided into what was called the Upper Creeks and the Lower Creeks, the Lower Creeks being those that were adopting European ways. Well, the Lower Creeks aligned themselves with the United States to end this civil war and put down the Upper Creeks. But the treaty that was negotiated in the wake of that was entirely was punitive to the entire Creek Nation. So we all suffered, and it's unfortunate that that's the way it shook out. But the way that we could best benefit the tribe was to find a commonality with the white men of the United States. It's
Now, how did the relationship between indigenous peoples and Freemasonry change as Oklahoma moved from being Indian Territory to statehood?
so the relationship there didn't particularly change. So Oklahoma became a state in 1907, and by that time, the Indian Territory was pretty flush with white men, I guess you could say. But when you look at that change, the Grand Lodge of Oklahoma Territory had been established in 1890 something, the late 1800s, and so they were operating independently on their own over there. But they all knew each other because those lodges in the Oklahoma Territory were originally chartered by the Grand Lodge of Indian Territory, and by that time, the lodges of Indian Territory had white membership. There were white men in the territory, either. I mean, these would have been men who were there legally, But the men who had married into the tribes and whatnot at that time. So it's one way to gain membership in the tribe in the late 1800s was through marriage. So that never really changed, I guess.
Right. Yeah. So how did I know your specialty is history, but is there still a feeling of connection among Indigenous peoples to Freemasonry, or has it become just a part of history?
No, I think there's still a connection, because if you look at throughout the history of the tribes, it was common for groups to arise within a tribe who would stand to propagate morals and good behavior and advance, civic society, and promote the general good. So I think when you take that concept of the wise men, the elders, who had these ideas that there were practices that should be done, I think that translates to Freemasonry pretty well. The late Jim Tresner often compared the senior deacon in the lodge guiding the candidate through the degrees to the shaman or medicine man of a tribe, guiding an individual on a spiritual journey. So I think there's still that level of connection as far as promoting the best of men, the best natures of men.
I always know when I'm hanging out with someone who
Yo,
has an Oklahoma connection, and two, someone that I'm going to get along with extremely well, because inevitably Jim Tresner's name comes up.
always pops up.
um, if people haven't haven't for Jim Tresner yet, they definitely should. He had an amazing ability to take the allegory of Freemasonry and make it relevant to people where they were. You could watch him gauge his audience and decide whether he was going to use Harry Potter, Star Wars, or what the mythology was that he was going to use to try to make people feel the allegory of Freemasonry. So I'm not surprised to learn that Jim compared the senior deacon to a shaman. That's just one more I'll have to add to my list of Jim's tricks. So yeah, how has Freemasonry been influenced through its contact with Indigenous culture, do you think?
I don't necessarily know that it has been in Oklahoma in particular has been influenced through Indigenous culture. I think there are people in Oklahoma that would like to think it has. I think Freemasonry as an institution is one of those entities that it has the ability to influence people more so than people influence it.
Yeah, fair enough. But I do think Freemasonry in every age where it has been successful has, I had a professor who was talking about Japanese culture when I was in college. And he said that Japan is like an amoeba. The outside shape constantly changes, but the core nucleus of the cell always remains the same. And I think Freemasonry is somewhat like that. There are things about it that change and that have changed over the course of its history. There's been constant change, but there's this nucleus that we hold on to very tightly that doesn't change, even in cases where it runs very counter to the dominant culture. And the example that I usually use is that Freemasons believe that some things are private. We keep secrets. And in the age of the Kardashians, that's very countercultural, right?
Very true. Yeah. And I'll add,
Do you see anything in Freemasonry really that runs strong?
David, you're breaking up again.
Uh, I don't know what I can
Say
do
that
about
again.
that.
Oh,
Give me 1 second.
can you hear us?
Yeah, okay. Can you hear me? Is
Yes.
that any
Yep,
better?
we're good. Yep.
Okay. Yeah, so in the age of the Kardashians, having a value that says that we keep secrets is very countercultural. I'm kind of wondering, do you know what do you see in Freemasonry that you believe might run counter to the dominant culture of the indigenous people who were joining Freemasonry early on?
I think what would run countercultural then was probably again the traditionalists who were trying to preserve their old ways, who were not interested in European influence, who were not interested in Christianity. I think there was probably some animosity towards that group, from that group of individuals, but even one of the traditionalist Creeks was, his name was Apothele and I haven't found the records where he was a Freemason, but numerous secondary sources indicate he was a Freemason, and he was a traditionalist character who was adamantly opposed to European influence. And whatnot, but he still found commonality in the lodge, and I have to ask myself, is that because he felt that he needed that connection in order to, again, he was a chief, he ended up becoming a chief of the Creek Nation, if he needed that connection in order to secure the tribe's future, which is a possibility, but you know uh, in particular, as far as Freemasonry and indigenous peoples go, um, I think, and this is something that in British Freemasonry we saw, that in American Freemasonry sort of fell by the wayside, and it was multiculturalism. Um, and I think that level of multiculturalism um, was might have been one of the main influences of indigenous Freemasonry here in the Indian Territory, and I say that because uh, you know, in indigenous lodges, you had white men and you had indigenous members, but there were other people in the nations as well. So that multiculturalism is probably important.
And I think Freemasonry, to some degree, facilitates that through, um, you know, through the notion that we bring people together who have different opinions, teaching people to live together in peaceful, dynamic disagreement is probably one of the hardest things that Freemasonry does, but possibly one of the most important in my experience.
And with the Cherokees in particular, I mean, that tribe was extremely divided by the time of the Civil War. So you've got different factions there that both sides had Masonic membership. So that's the fraternity. They still have this common ground in Freemasonry, which is particularly interesting when you consider that, because, for example, the Civil War was particularly devastating across the entire southern half of the United States. But when you look at the Civil War in Indian Territory, things were even worse here than anywhere else, because literally everything was destroyed in the war. Farms, homes, churches, nothing was spared, and it didn't matter which side you fell on. So these guys, these brothers, and these indigenous people, they all could connect in the lodge, even though the situation at hand here was particularly awful. So.
That reminds me, you bring up the Civil War. The Masonic connection to indigenous peoples that is most often referenced is Albert Pike during the Civil War. Are you familiar with that story? And Could you talk about that some?
Yes. So, Albert Pike in Oklahoma, Albert Pike is one of these gods among men, and there's a reason for that. Albert Pike spent a little time in the Indian Territory, and he became a Mason, and I believe my records show 1850 in Arkansas. He had also represented the Creek Nation, the Choctaws, and the Chickasaws in claims against the federal government in court, and had prevailed for them. So Albert Pike had a connection with the leading men of the five tribes. They knew him, and he knew them. And when he was sent by the Confederacy as an agent to negotiate treaties with the five tribes, they all knew exactly who he was. He had done good things for them, and by that point, he was a Mason, and most of them would have been Masons as well. So that furthered his diplomatic stance as far as being able to convince them to sign treaties with the Confederacy. The other thing I like to point out is, at the onset of the American Civil War, the federal government had an obligation to the five tribes. But in 1861, the federal government abandoned the Indian Territory and left the five tribes to fend for themselves. So we were looking for the best offer that was going to come around, and the United States had left us. So here comes Albert Pike, who everyone already knew, to negotiate these treaties. So he had good standing, and I think his good standing and the Masonic connection there certainly had an influence.
Now,
because those U.S. Army officers
understanding,
that were here, those U.S. Army officers that were here before they left, some of them were Masons as well. So if the United States had stayed, they could have used that same influence.
right?
Mhm.
Yeah, I read at some point that Albert Pike got in trouble with the Confederacy for not using the indigenous troops basically as cannon fodder, and
I don't know. I don't know that that's true, but he did have issues with the employment of his troops. So when he negotiated his treaties with the five tribes, the treaties indicated that the Indian cavalry regiments that were formed were not to be deployed outside of the bounds of the Indian nations without their consent. They were essentially militia, and they were not to be moved out of the Indian Territory unless the tribes consented. Well, the Confederate commander of the Trans-Mississippi, who I think at that time was Thomas Hindman over in Arkansas, had ordered Pike to move his Indian brigade over to Arkansas to support his operations there. And that was in violation of the treaties. The Indians were not in agreement, and Pike would not move his troops. Pike ultimately resigned, but that was definitely a point of contention. Was he had an obligation to these men who knew him, outside of the military, and he wasn't about to just let them be sent wherever at the whims of some commander over in Arkansas. The other challenge that Pike had is that his Indian brigade was severely undersupplied. In fact, there's a letter to Pike from Chili McIntosh, who was my fourth great grandfather, and Chili McIntosh indicates in the letter that his men are without adequate clothing. They have not received an adequate supply of gunpowder, and owing to these factors, they cannot go out on raids and operations. So Pike's command here in the Indian Territory was not a priority to anyone.
yeah, and the history of making treaties and breaking treaties with indigenous peoples is unfortunately quite long. It's interesting that Pike strived to be a man of his word.
Yeah, definitely, and that led to his resignation. you know, he disappeared from the scene as far as the Civil War goes. But his resignation, in my opinion, was prompted by those particular factors, that his command here in the Indian Territory was not being given the necessary attention, and the treaty stipulations were not being observed as they should have been. And so, in regards to moving his command outside of the Indian Territory, so at the Battle of Pea Ridge in the early part of the Civil War this was in Arkansas. The Indian troops refused to go to Arkansas until they were paid. So, I mean, the Confederacy, they had no, as far as I could see, they had no real intentions of particularly honoring their agreements that they had entered into, their treaties that they had entered into, because, you know, they hadn't been paid and they weren't going to leave until they had been paid. So.
Which isn't entirely unreasonable. You mentioned your illustrious ancestor, Chili McIntosh. Could you tell us a little bit about him?
So Chili is one of these men who, I guess you could call him a Renaissance man, because he served during the Red Sticks War in 1812, 1813. He met the Marquis de Lafayette when he toured the South in the 1820s. He personally led 700 Creek citizens west from the homelands in the Alabama, Georgia area to the new Indian Territory. And here, once they had arrived here, his first home he sold to the United States so it could become the Indian Agency. And he became a Baptist minister. By the time of the Civil War, he was in his 60s, and he took command of one of the Creek regiments of cavalry, and was active throughout the war as far as leading that regiment. He had served as a judge, generally just a tribal headman, and he was one of those. You can't talk about Creek history as far as moving west without mentioning him and the McIntoshes in general. So.
Yeah, he sounds, because of you, I looked him up and did a little research. And he just seems like one of those people who makes you deeply regret that you haven't done anything with your life.
Yes, very much so. Yeah, I mean, he was in his 60s, and he was fighting in the Civil War, and one of the early campaigns he went on, he was elderly, obviously, so he was driving a horse-drawn wagon is how he traveled on this particular campaign. He didn't ride a horse. He had my understanding was he either was missing a fair amount of his teeth or had false teeth. So I mean, I was not earlier this year, late last year, I was cast in a film by the Oklahoma Historical Society. I was cast as Chili McIntosh. Now I'm in my 30s. And I spent 2 hours in a makeup chair to look like I was in my 60s for 15 minutes of film, just to record this speech that he gave to his troops at the Battle of Honey Springs. And I mean, as a minister, he was one of those guys that could stand and deliver. So yeah, I definitely feel like I could do more with my life. So.
So, what's the relationship between Freemasonry and the tribes in Oklahoma now? Are there a lot of is there a lot of crossover between the two? Is there a real sense of distinct Freemasonry among Indigenous people, or
there's not really a distinct Freemasonry? The Grand Lodge of Oklahoma would like to think that there is a lot of that early spirit still there. when you look at the numbers and whatnot, and I think it's impressive because there were four lodges of primarily indigenous membership, and those included 3 of those still exist today, which I think is impressive. One of them was still operating into the mid 20th century in the 40s. But there's this enduring spirit when you consider that those early lodges that were primarily indigenous still exist today. They might not have a primarily indigenous membership today, but they still exist. They're still active and whatnot. And to me, there's this there's this saying among indigenous peoples that we are still here. And I think that applies to what those men who founded those early lodges, because what they created is still here. I don't know of many jurisdictions that can say that they're early lodges that were created by a group of people who are an extreme minority in this country today still exist.
Yeah, it's an excellent point, and I think you know you mentioned that the Grand Lodge of Oklahoma would like to believe that some of that early spirit still exists, and I'm sensitive to the fact that dominant cultures often um, um, try to assume some credit for non-dominant culture. But it does seem to me that the mere continued existence of those lodges provides a real connection for some men to that history. Um, I've talked about the fact my lodge was instituted in 1805, and there's this. I know a lot of the names of the past masters of the lodge. I know a lot of their personal history, because of that connection to them, men that I would not otherwise know about. So it's interesting that those lodges continue to exist, and even if they're not predominantly indigenous, I bet you, if you go into those lodges and you ask about the members from that early period, members of the lodge would be able to tell you about them.
Oh, definitely. And that's when I'm at my home lodge, which is Eufaula number 1. I mean, I can look up on the wall and I can see the photographs of men who were chief justices of the Creek Nation, who were chiefs of the Creek Nation. So those guys, and Cherokee Lodge number 10 in Tahlequah is the same way. It's important that you can look up on the wall and still you can see the legacy of those men, and that's key. You're obviously, you might not still be meeting in the same building, but you can see that legacy. And I think it's important for everyone to recognize that legacy. A lot of people see photographs on the wall and they're like, oh, those are just old fellas, not all that important. But when you dig into some of these guys, you really start to see, these weren't the average men. I've not done a lot in my short existence here, but some of these guys had done so much more by the time they were 30, that people overlook that, because Freemasonry today, and again, like I said, I've not done all that much, in my short existence, but I'm a past master, but I pale in comparison to George W. Stidham of Eufaula Lodge, who was our second past master, our second worshipful master, because he was Chief Justice of the Creek Nation and had fought in the Civil War and done so much. So.
Yeah, I think, well, extraordinary times and all that. So maybe you just haven't had the opportunity yet.
So I have Bob Davis sent me a Facebook message the other day. I don't know if he meant to send it to me, but he was like, today it occurred to me that a record needs to be made of who attended the convention to organize the Grand Lodge of Indian Territory in 1874. They were mostly Indians. And that's it. So that's all I have. I don't know if you could put any color onto that.
Well, there were, let's see, there were representatives of 3 lodges there that day in 1874, and that would have been, so my lodge, which is Eufaula number 1, was known as Muskogee Lodge at the time. We changed our name in the 1890s because we were known as Muskogee Lodge to be associated with a Muscogee tribe. But the city of Muskogee had been established by then, and they would come to have their own lodge. But we were meeting in Eufaula by then, the Eufaula district. So we became Eufaula Lodge. So it was the 3 lodges that represented that day were Eufaula Lodge number 1, Choctaw Lodge or Dokesville Lodge number 2, and Caddo Lodge number 3. Eufaula Lodge was a lodge in the Creek Nation, and Dokesville and Caddo lodges were lodges in the Choctaw Nation. So the men that were present that day were all Creek and Choctaws. The Cherokees were not present that day, and the Chickasaws were not present that day either. But yeah, it was primarily indigenous individuals with a handful of white men that were in the territory at the time. So, and those white men were typically Christian missionaries or businessmen of some caliber. So our first Grand Master of Indian Territory was a fellow by the name of Granville McPherson, and he was a newspaper man. So, but yeah, it's exactly true that, they would have all primarily been indigenous that day. And George W. Stidham of Eufaula, our second worshipful master, was there that day.
What can you tell us about the Native American degree team?
The Indian degree team. That's what they go by. So
I'm just looking at because somebody else wrote Native American degree team.
So the Indian degree team, they confer the 3 degrees of ancient craft masonry, and they do it in Indian regalia. And the regalia is primarily Plains Indian regalia, which is popular in the powwow scene. And those guys all, as a requirement to be on that team, they all participate in powwows across the country, and in Oklahoma, obviously. But they're all, the degree team is comprised of men who are all citizens of a tribal nation. It's not just 5 tribes. And again, like I said, they perform in Plains regalia. Now I've never had the opportunity to see them perform a degree, but I've seen them perform dance routines. So a few years ago, I was asked to give a talk at a Grand Lodge event where they confer a degree called the Sacred Order of the White Buffalo.
That was my next question.
Yeah, I had never participated in the Sacred Order of the White Buffalo until that day. So I'm now a perpetual member of the Sacred Order of the White Buffalo. But that was a degree that is really a fundraiser for the Grand Lodge building, so they can establish an endowment for their building. And that degree, as my understanding, was actually written by Jim Tresner. And they asked me to come talk because Jim Tresner used to give an introductory talk before the degree, and this was after he had passed on. So the week, I think it was 2 weeks before the event, I guess they were looking for somebody to talk, and they said, well, T.S. over there is an Indian. Let's have him come give us a talk about Freemasonry and Native Americans. So, I gave a talk there that day, and then that talk I sort of expanded on into a lecture that I had the honor of giving in Washington, D.C. To Union Lodge number 6. And then I was slated to give that same talk at Honey Springs Battlefield for the Oklahoma Historical Society, which is the talk that I had recorded on YouTube for them. So I had written on the history of my own lodge before, but I particularly enjoyed being able to learn to dive more into the records of the other indigenous lodges and whatnot. It was unique, or it was unique to me to read through the proceedings of the Grand Lodge of Arkansas and really get an idea of what was happening with Freemasonry in Indian Territory before the Civil War.
As on a slightly different note, you've written several books about the history of Freemasonry in Oklahoma. You have written at least two other history books, I think. What do you think is different about being a scholar of Masonic history and writing about Masonic history versus writing about other kinds of history?
So Masonic history is unique because there's so much that if you're not a member of the fraternity, you don't understand. And you can gloss over important things because you don't understand what's going on. So when you have that insider view, you can read things that someone else might not recognize. Oh, this is what this actually means. This is what's going on here. And I think that's what's unique about Masonic history, is that you got to be an insider to understand some things. I'm a member of the Oklahoma Historical Society, and our scholarly publication is the Chronicles of Oklahoma. Well, last year I received an edition of the Chronicles of Oklahoma, and there was a great article in there about early Oklahoma politicians, and the synopsis of the article was that nationally, early Oklahoma politicians were viewed as a bunch of cranks, and you could kind of still say that about Oklahoma politicians today. But there was one particular gentleman, and it was mostly about governors. There was one particular governor named Henry S. Johnston, who happened to also be Grand Master of Masons of the state of Oklahoma. Henry S. Johnston was impeached as governor and removed from office for general incompetence. And the article, I was reading through the article, like, wait a minute. So I flipped back to the footnotes, and I was cited in the notes of this article about Henry S. Johnston. But when I was reading the article, the author got multiple things wrong about Henry S. Johnston, and it was generally a lack of understanding of his Masonic memberships. So when you have that insider information, you can understand a little more about what's going on. So I always like to let our Grand Masters know in Oklahoma, our Oklahoma Grand Masters know that they have something in common with the governor, and that is that he was impeached from office
for general incompetence.
General incompetence.
I do think Freemasonry, I always tell candidates when they join that Freemasonry has had several hundred years to develop its own culture, its own language. We have special terms for everything. And I do think from the outside, it is an incredibly opaque organization because it presents itself so differently depending upon the moment in the event that you're watching. You know, sometimes we look like a philosophical society. Sometimes we look like a dinner club. Sometimes we look like, a bunch of good old boys who get together and have a beer and do some good in the community. Sometimes we look like, some sort of high ceremonial organization. It's a very difficult organization to wrap your hands around, and you really can't do it by analogy because there just isn't an organization that fills the same space as Freemasonry. It is really a unique institution, and I think that's the reason outsiders have so much trouble seeing it clearly.
Yeah, I agree with that.
I also think that if you look at the depictions of religion on popular TV, it always gets me angry when I'm watching TV and they're showing some sort of religious ceremony and they get the details wrong because they don't know it from the inside, and so they don't know that no priest would wear a purple stole at a wedding, right? So it's interesting to watch how popular culture misunderstands, and even scholars misunderstand the fraternity on a fairly regular basis. And we all experience that to a small degree in our daily lives when we meet people who say that their grandfather was a grand master. Chances are their grandfather was master of a lodge, and they just don't know the terminology well enough to know the difference most of the time. Yeah. So what about appendant bodies and indigenous involvement?
So a handful of gentlemen who were active in early Oklahoma Freemasonry, Indian Territory Freemasonry, they became involved in Royal Arch Masonry, and Royal Arch Masonry was particularly popular in the Indian Territory and even over in the Oklahoma Territory. So these guys that had gone to Washington D.C. had taken the Royal Arch degrees while also there. We had the first Royal Arch chapter established in the Indian Territory after the Civil War. I feel like it was in the 1870s, early 1870s, around the time of the establishment of the Grand Lodge. I might be a little off on the year there, but Royal Arch Masonry was popular amongst the Indian Territory lodges, probably to the same extent that Royal Arch Masonry was popular everywhere else. Cryptic Masonry and the Templar degrees came later, in the 1890s, 1880s, 1890s. So you don't see they didn't flourish in indigenous masonry like the Royal Arch did, because the Royal Arch had 20 years on those organizations. The Scottish Rite, that was always popular in Oklahoma, but again, the Scottish Rite is another one of those organizations that didn't really take off until the 20th century. So I mean, I think it's hard to understand that you're still dealing with Indian Territory in 1900, because Oklahoma doesn't become a state till 1907. So you've still got an Indian Territory up until 1907, but it's not, principally indigenous. But the Scottish Rite's big today. It was big in the 20s, but Royal Arch Masonry was really the institution that and it's the capstone. Obviously, it's the capitular degrees that worked with ancient craft masonry.
It's a pleasure to hear that as the Grand Representative of the Grand Royal Arch Chapter of Oklahoma near the Grand Royal Arch Chapter of Massachusetts. It's good to hear.
Well, the success of Royal Arch Masonry in the Indian Territory relied upon one man, and his name was Joseph S. Murrow. And Murrow was a Baptist missionary who was sent to the Indian Territory to help. He arrived here before the Civil War to help another missionary by the name of H.F. Buckner. Buckner was a member of what would become Eufaula Lodge No. 1. He was a Baptist as well. And Murrow goes out to the Seminole Nation from the Creek Nation and establishes a church there. At the onset of the Civil War, Murrow takes his family south to Texas for the duration of the war because the Indian Territory wasn't safe. And while in Texas, he joined Freemasonry. He became a Royal Arch Mason. He comes back to the Indian Territory in 1866-68 and establishes a lodge in a community called Boggy Depot. And that's where Freemasonry, after the Civil War and the Indian Territory sprang back to life, was at Boggy Depot. But Murrow, he was one of the main men behind the establishment of the first Royal Arch chapter, and that was Indian, and it still exists today, Indian Chapter No. 1, which was established in McAlester. And from there, everyone likes to think that the center of Masonic activity in Oklahoma is Guthrie, but the birthplace and of appendant masonry and what would become the capital of masonry in the early days was eastern Oklahoma, particularly McAlester and Muscogee. McAlester's in the Choctaw Nation, Muscogee's in the Creek Nation. So you had all of these different Masonic orders that were flourishing in the Indian Territory, in that region, and Royal Arch Masonry was one of those early institutions that gain speed, in particular in southeastern Oklahoma and the Indian Territory.
I can see, also just in thinking about it, I can see why the Royal Arch allegory would be particularly appealing during that time period.
Yeah, it's from a rebuilding perspective. Yeah.
Yeah, it gives you hope that that which has been destroyed can be restored, and that must have been appealing during that time period. Nicholas, do you have anything else for TS?
No, I'm just trying to digest all of this.
Yeah, the bad thing about talking to someone who really knows their stuff is getting everything out of them that you want to know.
Yeah. So, TS, if someone wanted to learn more about this, if they wanted to learn more about you or your books, where can you be found? What kind of stuff are you working on this year? Give us the whole pitch.
So I manage a blog on Oklahoma Masonic history, and that's really where essentially everything I write gets published. I wouldn't say everything, but and it is OK Masonic History .blogspot.com, and if I sometimes I get into obscure points of Oklahoma Masonic history, but anything that perks my interest, I try to dig into deeper. So, but if Oklahoma Masonic history is of interest to a person, that would be the place to go. There's no one else doing what I do. So.
Well, that's one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you, is because I really do admire what you're doing. And I think it would be wonderful if every jurisdiction had somebody who had your interest, your patience, and your scholarship to dig in and start to find the little details that bring the history to life, which is something that I think that you're particularly good at.
Thank you.
And so many of us have the broad sweep of the history of our jurisdiction and some of the official story of our jurisdiction, but really getting to know the figures who were influential, some of whom have just more or less disappeared from the history that we get told commonly. I think it's an important thing, and there's a little piece of me that agrees with the ancient Egyptians that as long as you're remembered, there's still some life to you. So I really admire what you do.
When you say
one of my
that,
favorite pardon?
I said when you say that about the Egyptians, when I was working on my books about the Grand High Priest and the illustrious Grand Masters, which is they're collections of biographical sketches, and reading about every one of those guys and locating their photographs, and I'm thinking I might be the first person who has thought about some of these guys or set eyes on these guys in years, and I hope I'm one of those people that as long as someone is pictured somewhere and discussed somewhere, they're not forgotten. And I think that was kind of one of what I enjoyed most about doing that.
Yeah, it shows. One of my favorite interviewers routinely ends interviewers with this question, so I'm going to do it with you tonight. What should I have asked you that I forgot to ask?
Okay, that's a really good question.
That's a good question.
Or what's the most nerdiest fact that you're like, man, this is the coolest thing ever that absolutely nobody else.
I have a paper that is going to be published in the Chronicles of Oklahoma, hopefully this year. Things have gone awry, obviously, in the world, but this paper deals with a Masonic temple in Oklahoma that was known as Mount Moriah. Mount Moriah was erected in McAlester on a hill north of the city, sort of in the middle of nowhere, for the sole purpose of conferring the degrees of the royal and select masters. And they built this temple. It had an underground portion with a secret vault, and there was a tunnel that connected the temple to its dining hall. It was this huge project, this huge undertaking. It was completed in the late 1910s. It was apparently nationally known at the time, and then by the late 20s through the 30s, it had fallen by the wayside. No one cared about it anymore. They'd stopped going there for meetings. The building fell into disrepair. It exists in ruins today. And it's sort of, I would call it the true Masonic secret of Oklahoma. Because if you go talk to people in Western Oklahoma, they don't know anything about Mount Moriah. They've never heard about it. But if you go talk to the guys in Southeastern Oklahoma, oh, it's this secret that they all know about. And when they were kids, they'd ride their bicycles out to this building and go through the ruins and whatnot. And no one knows about it. So I think it's the Masonic secret of Oklahoma. So that hopefully that will come out in the Chronicles of Oklahoma this year. So Mount Moriah is a building worth knowing about.
I think it's always worth knowing about our history, and the one of the things that always impresses me is the value that men placed on the fraternity. They, it wasn't any easier or any cheaper or any less. It didn't call for any less sacrifice to build a building like that back then versus today. They just scraped together what they had, put it together, and did the work because it was incredibly important to them. Mm-hmm. And I think telling those stories might inspire some of us to, people who've heard me go off on this before, but to dig wells and plant trees so that we don't go hungry and we don't go thirsty. Thank you so much, T.S., for joining us today. I'm sure that our listener, as I refer to him, will be pleased and gratified to learn so much about the history of the Indian Territory and Freemasonry and Indigenous involvement in Freemasonry. And you're always welcome to come back. Write another book.
Thank you for having me. So I enjoyed being here. So
great. You have a good evening. And Nicholas, are you taking us out, or are you going to add it after?
I'm going to add it after.
Some things happen in post.
Yeah.
Is there anything else that we need to do this evening, gentlemen?
No. Stay well, stay safe. Please stay indoors.
Yeah. To absent brethren.
Have a good night, guys.